Dr. McKenna, what is top of mind for you this morning?
All right, Sab. So you know that moment when you are introduced to someone more deeply and you realize that there's a kindred spirit out there who is driven by many of the same things, but you didn't realize it until that moment. And I think many people feel that. And in preparation for this podcast, and after listening to Stephen Covey on Nate Regier's podcast and digging back into some of his writing, I saw that kindred spirit. And even in his description of wholeness in his most recent book, Trust and Inspire, I felt that. And in my younger years, I might have felt a sense of either weird competitiveness or that my thoughts weren't original. But now in my 50s, I am encouraged because I know I'm not alone in fighting the battle for trust and whole leaders. I get a little emotional saying that actually. And what I also know about our guest today is that I understand that his deep dive into trust started with crucible experiences in his own life and work. And I relate to his experiences that I've had, that I've heard him describe about his dad. And while his dad is a great public figure, he was even better at home. I've heard Stephen describe that. And my dad is like that. And he turned 96 today. And my dad had a very public position all his life and is known by so many as a great leader, but he was even better husband and family member. And as a leader in his generation, I don't think he thought about the possibility of building trust more systematically, but would fully relate to the necessity of it in every organization he led. And I am humbled that someone who has been in the deep waters of trust and leadership for so many years is here with us today to help us move forward, to help us take action, to process the research we've done at Wild Leaders, and to come alongside us as we come alongside him. And so, Sabbath, will you introduce our guest?
Yes, let's get this wild conversation going. And welcome to the wild conversation where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to have a wild conversation with someone who barely needs an introduction. Stephen M.R. Covey has made it his life's work to understand trust in leadership, in organizations, and across our lives. His seminal book, The Speed of Trust, is a book that Dr. McKenna describes as one of the most important books of our generation. Stephen believes the best leaders don't control people, they ignite them. He's led a $160 million company, coached top execs around the world, and carries the legacy of his father, the Seven Habits legend. But Stephen's out to build something different: trust-powered, people-first leadership that actually works. He's bold, brilliant, and just wild enough to believe leadership can be deeply human and still deliver results. And just like our mission at Wild Leaders, he's pushing for a complete reformation in how we think about developing whole leaders and measuring and building trust that sustains. Most importantly, he's our newest wild friend. So welcome, Stephen M.R. Covey.
Wow. Well, thank you, Sabbath, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Rob, for hosting me along with Sabbath here on this Wild Conversations podcast, and excited to have this conversation with you, especially because, to your point, Rob, we're kindred spirits
Yeah.
that both feel compelled to focus on something so foundational for not only any individual and any leader, this trust, but also so foundational for all society,
Yeah.
for humankind.
Yeah. Stephen, we didn't prep you for this, but we're going to play a quick round of wild cards. So what we have is a deck of wild cards that usually has about 50. Each has a developmental question, and I
Okay.
pulled 10. So we're just going to each pick a number between 1 and 10, and I'll ask the question on the card and we'll answer it. I'll go first. You can go next, and Dr. McKenna will round us off. No pressure. You can answer it in one sentence or you can tell a story. It's just a fun way to dive in quick. So I'm going to choose number 5. What do others need from you that will require you to stretch yourself? Today, I would say that is presence. in the different things that I find myself needing to do today, different people that I'll sit with, including my husband and my kids and team members. I think what they need from me is a focused presence. All right, Stephen, pick a number between 1 and 10.
Okay, I'll pick number 7. It's a lucky
Okay.
number in our family.
Number 7, what would change if you communicated more clearly and listened more effectively?
I think that I would be far more effective as a leader if I listened more effectively, because it's like my father taught in 7 Habits: seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Mm,
And if you listen really effectively with the intent to understand, not with the intent to reply, but rather to understand, not to agree or disagree, not to judge, not to evaluate, but just to understand, that by achieving that understanding with another, they become far more open to be influenced by you when you have first been influenced by them. And so we're far more effective in our communication. And if it's clear communication, even more so when others first feel understood. And so I think I'd be more effective at achieving my ideas and thoughts if I first start by understanding others, where they're coming from, to where they feel understood. The key to influence is
mm,
to first be influenced.
yeah.
Okay. Thank
Well
you.
said. I'll go with number 8, Sab.
All right. What did you experience in the last 24 hours that may have been a moment that mattered?
I have three things, and one of them's still coming. One of them was we celebrated Megan, a key leader on our team, who is stepping out of her role in this moment, and that was an important moment to celebrate her as she heads out to be really focused on raising her kids and her family. So we celebrate that. The second thing is that my dad turned 96 today, and so I'm looking forward to celebrating with him, and I'll have a brother and sister there too, and so that's great. And then this conversation is a moment that matters to me, and so those are my three things. Thank
Thank
you, Sabbath. Stephen, I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast, and your influence on me over the years and precisely more recently has been profound as Wild Leaders is dug deep into trust. And so I'm so grateful you're here. And so I just kind of want to dig straight into the deep waters if we could. I want to ask you a
Great.
first question. Is in your mind and in your work, as you travel around, you work with leaders and you see the impact of trust, is trust as big a deal today for you as it was when you first published Speed of Trust? Or is it an even bigger deal today? I'm so curious about your thinking on that.
It's even bigger today. It went in 2006. I first published The Speed of Trust, and it felt big back then, and it felt like, gosh, this is addressing a challenge and an opportunity that was so timely and relevant, and it was. But here we are, a couple decades later, and I feel like trust is even bigger today than ever before. Partly because we're living in a world of declining trust, where it tends to be going down around us, and so many of our institutions in most countries in the world, and also people are becoming more aware of it, and it's less something that was, before I would speak of it, and it was seen kind of um, as an enabler to the other things we were trying to do. That with trust you could engage people better, we could collaborate better, innovate better.
Mhm.
And so it was an enabler, and it remains an enabler to all these other things. But today we're also just flat out focused on trust as an outcome, as a goal, as an objective, to build high trust teams, high trust organizations, high trust relationships, because of how trust in and of itself, apart from enabling anything else, is so vital. It's a currency in our world today,
Mhm.
and especially in a world of declining trust. To be trusted is such an advantage for any leader, for any organization. And so while it's always mattered, it's even more important today than ever before. And so I feel like my work, even though I've been at it for 2 decades,
Yeah.
I feel like it's in a sense just beginning.
Huh.
Is the need for trust has never been greater than it is right now.
I love it that you just said that. And that gives a lot of permission for people who have been on a path for a while. And it's okay to feel that it's just beginning. And I'm curious about what is at the bleeding edge of your thinking about trust today that's been forming and shaping over these past 2 decades that might be culminating in this moment. But what is at that cutting edge right now?
Yes. Here's what I'm thinking about today. And some of this I was thinking about before, but I'm now in a whole different place. It's like the quote from T.S. Eliot, who said, "We shall never cease from exploring.
Hmm.
And the end of all our exploration will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." And in some ways, I feel like I'm arriving where I started, but I know that I know it for the first time on some of these insights. Other insights are things I've been are kind of new and fresh. So here's one that I've been working on really for 20 years, but I feel like I'm arriving where I started and know it for the first time. And that is the idea that trust is truly the one thing that changes everything. And again, that's not so much a new insight, but I feel like I've waded through the complexity and I've come out on the other side of complexity to a very simplicity way of looking at this, that if you get good at trust as a leader, as a team, or as an organization, you can do everything else better. It's a performance multiplier of everything else we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Collaborate, innovate, engage, attract people, retain people, inspire people. Greater speed, lower cost. I've been saying that for a while, but everything we're trying to do
Yeah.
goes up with trust. And so that's a key insight. Here's a second, and it's related to that one, that trust is learnable as a
Hmm.
skill,
Hmm.
as a competency,
Hmm.
the ability to create trust on purpose, intentionally. It's not you either have it or you don't. That's a starting point. But you can build trust on purpose. You can become it can become a competency that you have as a
Mhm.
leader. It's part of who you are. It's part of how you lead. And you can start at any point and say, I value trust. I want to focus on this as both a means to an end and as an end in and of itself. Trust is a learnable competency. Trust not only affects speed and cost. That was the big breakthrough insight on speed of trust, is that trust is quantitative. You can measure it and you can measure the outcomes of that. And it affects the speed at which we can move and the cost of everything. And low trust is a tax, high trust is a dividend. But that, as important as that is, and that matters to everyone, that, to business people, to organizational people, because everyone's got budgets, speed, cost, they matter. That's vital. But as vital as that is, the greater impacts of trust are the qualitative side of trust.
Hmm. Hmm.
About trust creates energy and trust creates joy.
Hmm.
And energy and joy writ large is well-being. And so what it does to people and to a person and to a relationship, it's transformative, creating energy and joy, well-being. So trust is not only good for the business, it's good for the people in
Hmm.
significant and profound ways. And the neuroscience on this that has come out is just overwhelming, breathtaking
Hmm.
of what trust does. And we all know it and feel it at a personal level. Be part of a high trust team, high trust culture is just energizing and fun, creative, generative. And you contrast that to being part of a low trust team, low trust culture, how that is exhausting and no fun. And so we all kind of know this personally, but the data, the neuroscience on this is just overwhelming and inspiring.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the things that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, one of the things I want our listeners to hear, this is one of the reasons in our moments together already, you are a leader in process. There's a sense in which, sometimes you'll hear leaders where they kind of sound like they've arrived and it's all done and baked in. One thing I appreciate about you is that it's apparent that you are continuing to deal with the real story of trust, not just around you, but within you, and continuing to learn and grow. And I appreciate that so, so much. The other thing that you mentioned, that it's so important for people to continue to understand, and this is why I want people to go back and read your book again if they didn't read it before, is that so often trust, we know we can't do anything without it. That's been my journey into trust is much younger than yours. That we know we don't even get in our cars and drive down the road without trust. We don't go to the local coffee shop to meet someone there without trust. We
Right.
don't take our car to a business to get it fixed without trust. We can't sustain our marriages without trust. I mean, these are all things that you say, and I can't help but say that to our listeners if you think about it that way. But the thing about it is that so often for so many people, and this is where I always feel like we should play the song, the Boston song, More Than a Feeling, that trust is more than a feeling.
Yeah.
That it almost feels like vapor or an oxygen where we know we have to have it, but we reach out to grab it and it feels like it disappears. And something that you say over and over and again, that when I began my journey and Wild Leaders began its journey into trust more recently, that it's something you can measure. And I wanted to ask you something about that because I was so affected by when you would talk about you can measure trust even if you only measured speed and cost, increasing speed and decreasing cost, you'll know that trust is there when it's occurring. And the wild journey into trust, I didn't begin with trust. I started out developing whole leaders. And then
Mhm.
through a set of assessments we had built, it would target things like their purpose and calling, their competence, whether or not they were supported and surrounded, whether or not they were invested in other people, whether they were learning from their experiences. And so we developed these assessments. And then it's like, Stephen, one thing that emerged was we realized as people were talking about these things together with this scaffolding, trust was increasing. How would you explain the connection between leaders and trust?
Well, it's kind of the journey that you've been on, Rob, as you worked on developing whole leaders, integrated leaders, and looked at what they were doing and how they could become this whole leader. Sounds like you found that as they developed and improved, that therefore their ability to build and grow that trust, the impact on trust would go up with it.
Yeah.
I don't think you can separate the two, leadership and trust. I think they're completely overlapping. In fact, I'm going to quote from Warren Bennis, who said, leadership without mutual trust is a contradiction in terms. In other
Mm,
words, we're not leading if we're not creating trust. We might be managing, we might be administering, but we're
mhm.
not leading. That the heart of leadership is trust.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
It's not the only thing. There's other things that we can do as leaders and need to do. It's just that trust is the foundational element of it, the heart of it, the foundation of it. And great leadership is always defined by strong trust. And
Mm, mm,
if there's that trust is not there, then I'm going to argue that we're probably into managing and administering, but not leading. So to
mm.
me, they're really, in a sense, two sides of the same coin, one and the same. And it's very hard to have great leadership without trust.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that people can't be moving forward and doing things, but I would argue they're probably managing, not leading. And nothing
Yeah.
wrong with managing. It's just you manage things, you lead people. And so we want to lead people. Trust is the foundation of it.
Yeah.
So that's what
So
I view.
it's so good.
That's my way of saying it's the one thing that changes everything. And I
Yeah.
think your journey, that as you looked at your whole and integrative leader development, and you came up with trust, you also came to the same conclusion. Trust is the one thing that changes everything.
Yes, that's right. One of the wild leaders sayings when we talk about our methodology and even our mindset, the way we think about these things is we talk about focusing on the one with an eye to the many. That so often as organizations grow, they have a necessity for building scale. And the challenge is that as they begin to scale, they oftentimes lose track of the one. It's like you kind of lose track of the humanity of the individual.
Right.
But if we focus all of our attention on the one, we lose the reality that leaders are also have to be thinking about scale. And so that's our statement about that is focusing on the one with an eye to the many within the mind, the heart, and the competency and the call of the one. So that's where leader development was my thing. And so we describe that as personal trust, that it all has to start there. And then I go back and I read Speed of Trust, and I'm like, and we call that personal trust, you call it self-trust. And I was like, and you say that. This is where it begins. So when you describe self-trust and that start there, tell me why you start there.
Yeah. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, trust is built and created from the inside out, not the
Mm,
outside in. And the very start of inside out is each of us as individuals, even as individuals before us as leaders. Even that's an inside out approach of who I am as a person. And then I'll go to who I am as a leader. But it even who I am as a person, my character,
hmm
my competence, who I am, more than what I know or what I can do. It's who we are. It's our
Yeah.
character, our integrity, our intent, our competence. That's our capabilities, our results. This self trust. Do I trust myself? Do I give to my team a leader who they can trust? Is it smart to trust me? This is all the self trust. And
Yeah.
from that, it ripples out from ourselves into our relationships one on one.
Mm,
And
mm.
think about it. It's hard to build trust with others if we don't trust ourselves.
Yeah.
But if you trust yourself, it's far more easy, natural, and abundant to build trust with others. But that self-trust comes first. And from that springs all kinds of possibilities and opportunities. And so it's very much you look in the mirror, not out the window at everybody else, but look in the mirror. Do I trust myself? And do I give to my team a teammate, a leader who they can trust? Is it smart to trust me? And I ripple out from there. So I use the ripple effect of trust metaphor. Salt
Yeah.
water comes down, the ripples, the waves. They start at the inside, they ripple out. Self trust leads to relationship trust, which leads to team trust, which leads to organizational trust, which leads to market trust, which leads to stakeholder trust, and then to
Yeah.
societal trust, inside out. And so if you want to diagnose trust, assess it, diagnose it, measure it, diagnose from the outside in. That's really
Mm,
a useful construct. But if you want to change, develop, and transform trust, you got to do it from the inside out. Can I
yeah.
share just a brief experience on this, Rob? I'll never
Please.
forget one time I was doing a speed of trust session and I was at a break. And what I'd done right before the break is I gave the 5 waves of trust, this inside out process of how trust is built from the inside out, starting with ourselves. And I had someone come up to me after the break and said, "Hey, Stephen, this is really helpful what you've been talking about because it kind of describes for me what's going on in my life in a way that I'm now crystal clear on." And I said, "Tell me more." And he said, "Well, look, I'm not very happy with my life. I'm not where I thought I would be. My career's not gone the way I wanted it to be. For years, I've blamed everybody else. My first job, can't trust my boss. And, get a new boss, can't trust that boss either. So I leave the company, go to a new company, can't trust the boss there, can't trust the company. I go home to my community, can't trust my neighbors because I don't even trust my kids."
Mm,
And then when you went through the 5 waves of trust, I realized what my problem is.
mm,
Then he kind of looked around make sure no one was overhearing this. And he looked at me and he said, Stephen, I don't trust myself.
Hmm.
I don't trust myself. And I realize now that I'm projecting that distrust of myself out onto everybody else.
Hmm.
So what do I do? And my simple answer was, if you could focus on self-trust and your own personal integrity, you can begin to get that sense of clarity, of integrity, of power. So what I would do if I were you, I would start by learning to make and keep commitments to yourself in the little things,
Hmm.
and go from that small commitment to the next commitment to the next commitment. And you'll gain a sense of integrity, of clarity, of power as you build that self-trust to then be able to build all kinds of other trust, relationship, team trust, organizational trust. But it always begins with ourselves
Hmm.
inside.
And I love it that you're giving more language to the concept of whole leader development and how important self-trust is to that entire process. It begins within. And it's so interesting because you know me, leader development has been my whole
Yes.
career. And if people ask me like, and I'm also an assessment guy, I'm a psychologist. So I like assessment because it starts a conversation, it provides a scaffolding on some of the most important topics related to developing leader capacity. And it was if someone asked me, and I got asked this last week, what is if you were to name one thing that's occurring when someone engages in that level of intentional development where they're assessing their competence. So now I know what I'm good at, but I also know where I've got problems. They're increasing their level of support. They're getting clarity around their purpose and their call in their life. They're making progress on their goals. They're becoming more composed under pressure. All these things that I developed assessments around. And they asked me, what's the number one thing? And I would, you know what I say, Stephen, as I say, I think the number one thing that increases is what psychologists would describe as developmental efficacy, the belief that I could change. And it's so interesting to think about that concept related to what you just described with self-trust, that you can get intentional about developing that individual level capacity. As another leader said to us, oh, you're in the business of deep-seated leader development, like seating a leader deeply in an identity, in a position, in a posture to be able to serve, but also understanding what they're good at in those fundamental things that leading to all these things you're describing in self-trust. You're just lighting up my brain around those things. So speaking of which, I wanted to ask you something else, as long as we're on this leader development path,
Yeah.
because I know you talk a lot, more recently in your most recent book, you say that we need to move from command and control to trust and inspire forms of leadership. And one of my questions was, and this is just the way my mind works, Stephen, is how does a leader maintain strength and clarity and conviction while also having that posture of inspiration and trust, like having that connective tissue, that willingness to bless other people and not just be impressive, as you would say. Like, how do we maintain that, what I sometimes feel is a paradoxical expectation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's at the heart of really what I mean by a trust and inspire leader. A command and control leader is kind of more the traditional hierarchical, the idea that leadership is a position and they're getting strength from their position and the like, and traditional hierarchical type of approach. Whereas trust and inspire is different in kind. It's not formal authority, it's the moral authority that comes. But it
Hmm.
comes from having both character and competence.
Hmm.
And that's speaking to the two dimensions, the paradoxical combination you're looking at. Because, the competence is that strength and that clarity and that vision. This is what we're about and who I am and what I'm about and my capabilities. My strength. I have that. That's the competence side of this. That's vital. But the character is also vital too. And that's the integrity of who I am, including my humility. A combination of both humility and courage.
Hmm.
That's that paradoxical combination in and of itself. Humility and courage. That's the vulnerability and the idea that there are principles that govern. So I'm humble to that, but I'm also courageous. I'm strong. I want both. I also have empathy That's the humility, that's the character side. And yet I perform and I deliver and I get results, I get outcomes. And I expect that of others too. But if I
Mm,
could apply empathy and performance together, that's like character and competence. In your words, it's like the caring and the clarity and strength.
yeah. Yeah.
That I believe that that paradoxical combination is the very essence of what is needed today.
Yeah.
Because to be one dimensional in either of those dimensions is insufficient to meet
Yeah.
the needs of today. A person that's humble but not courageous can't take on today's challenges.
Right.
A person that's courageous but not humble won't do it very well either because they won't adapt and respond. They'll get too much ego invested into things. You
Yeah.
need to have both. And so the paradoxical combination is the solution. And trust and inspire is my way of saying this is the kind of leadership needed today. And rather than being soft, it's actually the strongest form of leadership that there is. It's
Yeah.
being authoritative without being authoritarian. It's
Yeah.
being strong without being forceful. It's being decisive without being autocratic. It's having control without being controlling.
Yeah.
And so it's a third alternative, really. And I think it's the type of work that you're working on, Rob,
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
This paradoxical combination of having that strength and the
Yeah.
clarity while also being relatable, vulnerable, open, authentic.
Yeah.
And when you achieve that, that's the kind of leadership that people relate to today, that they want today, and that can have great impact.
Yeah. I was speaking to a group of CEOs last week, and someone said in the room, we should all be writing Peter Drucker a check. And it was interesting because I've been back into Drucker's work, and he brilliantly describes that paradox in so many places. Thank you for that, because I think for many of our listeners, that reality that there is a paradoxical, there's a tension in that you have to come in decisive and strong without being authoritative, but also having that humility and that connective tissue is so critical. So, Stephen, I know that you had a chance to review our State of Trust at Work report looking at trust. And I really wanted to hear your thoughts on something that occurred that we found that even in organizations that are strongholds of trust, where there was high team trust and also high organizational trust, that actually the number is it's close to half of employees still experience a lack of trust. In other words, sometimes we assume that if trust is somewhere, it's everywhere, but that's not necessarily true. And a lot of CEOs they want to just know it's all green, it's all looking good, but in fact, we always question trust. And I wondered if you would speak to that. Like, is trust is something that is this ideal that we're looking for the ideal, or is it how do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, it really is a journey and an ongoing journey for each of us and for our teams and for our organizations. And at the end of the day, it's very personal and it's relational. And so it might be that there could be decent trust, even high trust on a team. And yet there may be a team member who might feel still distrusted in a personal relationship on that team. And so they, even though they're part of a high trust team, there could be pockets of distrust or experiences of distrust that people still experience where maybe someone is kind of not trusting that person, not giving trust to them.
Mm,
Maybe they're trustworthy people working together, but not extending trust to each other in every
mm,
case. And that can happen. And so it's really relational. And so it's why it puts such a premium on, on never believing that we've arrived. And even as you look at and you
mm,
might say, look, our organization is doing pretty good. We built some trust on the team, but we got to constantly be working on it, building it one on one. And how you build the trust with the one can build it with the many, as you know, as you talk about in your work
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
And so we're trying to build it one on one, and we don't just assume it and take it for granted. And that yes, we got maybe the metrics come up that say, hey, we have some good team trust here, and maybe good organizational trust, and We still need to build it relationship by relationship, person by
Mm,
person, leader by leader, one
mm,
person at a time. And
mm.
it's built that way. And that's synergistic in and of itself, because as you work on it with the one, you can build it with the many. And so there is a synergy to this, but it's not an automatic thing, that because it's still relational at the end of the day. And so um, so someone might be operating, they're a member of a high trust team in a high trust culture, but still their lived experience might be that they're not feeling trusted by their immediate leader, or
Yeah.
trusted by a team member that they've got to collaborate and partner and work with. And so they still could feel the pain and the cost of distrust, even in an environment of higher trust. And actually,
Uh, uh,
in some ways, that can be even more painful, because they know the difference. they, they,
yeah.
they experience it with others, what it's like to work with being trusted, and maybe now we're experiencing what it's like to not be trusted with one, and the contrast is so striking, and they prefer working in trusting relationships than in a distrusting one. I've seen it myself. I've had my own experiences where I felt like I was part of a high trust team. It would be a stronghold in your language of
Yeah.
being a high trust team, high trust organization, and yet I personally have also experienced significant pains of distrust and low trust because of having individual relationships in which I wasn't trusted, and I felt I was being micromanaged,
Mm,
and just how that that the pain of that, and the lack of energy, the lack of joy was was very, very striking,
yeah.
especially compared to the other experiences I have. So it's personal, it's relational, and we build it again, person by person, leader to leader, and leader to direct report, and vice versa. And so it just shows you again the intricacy and the inside out working of trust at every level.
Mm,
And so we're always on this journey,
yeah.
and there's so
Yeah.
many different levels of trust that are interconnected all along
Yeah.
the way.
And it's in our research, one of the things that blew me away was that nearly half of all employees in our sample were operating in a jungle of trust, in a chaotic space where, and when I saw the data, Stephen, it kind of floored me because, like you, I've been there where I don't trust my team members and I don't really have a high trust in the organization, and I'm not feeling like I'm doing the things necessary to be trustworthy. And it eats you away from the inside out, like you would say. It's just, those are tough, tough times. One of the things I want to ask you about that we discovered as well is that this ability to be composed and to show up well in high conflict moments was one of the lowest areas in team trust, where if they could not, what I describe as fight well, and that's one of the wild leaders, actually, our statements in our charter is that we will fight well, primarily, Stephen, because I don't. You know what I mean? So I needed to be reminded. So it's like, we're going to disagree, we're going to fight, but we're going to do that well. And we're going to work hard to stay connected and also to stay true to what's important to us in those moments. But we also found that that ability to compose yourself in conflict was one of the top drivers of team trust. So it was the lowest, but it's a driver. Can you speak to that capacity to handle conflict and how important that is to trust?
Yeah, it's vital. And it's really, maybe in some ways, a good test of trust.
Mm, mm,
Do we have it? Because it's easy to kind of maybe have that trust when everyone agrees and sees the world the same, and we feel like, hey, we're all aligned perfectly and everything else. A good test of it is what happens when we see the world differently, and how do we approach that when there's disagreement
mm,
and
mm,
conflict. And and again, this is not just about being nice, because you've got to, you want to make sure that we're real, and we're taking the issues head on, and we're not skirting them. But it's finding the ways to actually interact together when we see the world differently, as a good test of trust, and a good process of actually building more trust when we take on these tough issues together with respect of each other. So I have some behaviors in my speed of trust work that work together and are balanced by each other. So you want to talk straight, tell the truth, call things what they are, but you also want to demonstrate respect for what you hear. And so, it's you want to be high in both. And some people are great straight talkers, but they're not showing enough respect for others that see the world differently. Other people are great at showing respect, but they're not really confronting the issues, taking stuff head on if they're not telling the truth, if they're just kind of not wanting to, just trying to preserve the peace. And well, they're not going to take the real issues head on. You need both. You need to confront reality, but you also need to listen first. And so it's a matter of being able to do both
Yeah.
is a good test of the trust that you're building. I'd also refer us to Patrick Lencioni's work on the 5 dysfunctions of a team,
Yeah.
where he's saying the very first dysfunction is where there's an absence of trust, and then the next one is when there's then this unhealthy conflict. And so that's kind of taking your point of that you got to be composed while you take
Yeah.
on the tough issues, and so when there's not trust, then the conflict, the disagreement is unhealthy.
Yeah.
You don't trust each other, and you're questioning the agenda and the motive and the intent. And but when there's a healthy, a strong trust there to begin with, then the conflict, the
Yeah.
disagreement can become healthy, can become creative, even
Yeah.
synergistic. And that's what we want and need. That's where synergy comes from, is where people see the world differently, but they trust each other. This is
Yeah.
where innovation comes from. Is a
Yes.
is a an interplay or even collision of differences, but in an environment of trust. So
Mm-hmm.
that test you're referring to
Yeah.
is vital and will take you to a whole new level when you can manifest both and display both, being able to take on the tough things and disagree, and
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also keep that composure and
Yeah.
not assume negative intent with each other,
Right.
but
Yeah.
positive intent as a way as a means of bringing it together. So I
Yeah.
think that is the test. That's why it's a driver, as you've
Yeah. Yeah. That's
identified in
right.
your research.
That's right. And that's the title of my second book was Composed. And then we created an assessment called the Leading Under Pressure Inventory that helps a leader assess their default tendency toward either more truth speaking or toward more on the connective side, toward the peacekeeping piece. And that you have to do both, but we have defaults under pressure. That is so good, Stephen. Thank you. I have one other question before Sabbath wraps us up here in just a moment. And what do we when it comes to the future, what is it that's at the front of your mind that we still need to understand better? Is there something that's occurring that you're saying like we even what we need to study next, to understand it better at this point in history?
Yeah. Well, I think back to what I said earlier, what we've learned in the last 5 years around the neuroscience of trust is
Mm,
really significant, even profound.
mm,
And I think for all the focus that you and I and some others are putting on trust, even with all this attention and focus, I still think we're underestimating its power and impact by a factor of 10,
ah, well,
maybe even by a factor of 100.
wow.
And that's with all that we're focused on. And so to really, continue down this path of showing how trust is truly the one thing that changes everything,
Mm,
and to show the integrative nature. That's why I love your work on,
yeah.
whole and integrated,
Mm-hmm.
the integrative nature of trust to
Mm-hmm.
everything else that we're doing. We've
Yeah.
got some good research. You're doing some great research. We're moving down that path, and we're still on the front end of it, of what's going to come out.
Yeah.
Also, I would say this, and this is another insight that I've been working on. If to really understand the components of trust, not just the outcomes, you can measure the
Yeah.
outcomes, not just the level of trust, by measuring by things that you're doing and that I'm doing and a few others that, not a lot of people, but a few of us are, that looking at the level of trust on a team, in an organization, looking at the confidence that is there or not, but also understanding the components that lead up to that around the character side,
Yeah.
integrity and intent around the competence side,
Yeah.
capabilities, results, and then your model, your version of that, and then also around the behaviors that build it and why to understand the components so that you can not only know why trust is what it is, but how to move the needle on it, what the
Yeah.
leading indicators are, what those levers are that we can do to
Yeah.
move the needle on trust. To get even better at this is so important. And I'll tell you what becomes so exciting to me is here's a simplified version of creating trust. To create trust, if trust is the outcome we want, high trust relationship, high trust team, high trust culture, yes, we need to be trustworthy and we earn that. How do we earn that? By demonstrating our character and our competence and behaving in ways that build trust. So trust is earned, but it's not enough because you could
Mm.
have trustworthy people working together and no trust between them. So in
Yeah.
addition to being trustworthy, we, and especially we as leaders, also need to be trusting.
Yeah.
We need to be willing to give that trust, to extend that trust. Trust is given. And I
Yeah.
think we need
Yeah.
more research on why
Mm.
that is so powerful, what it does to people,
Yeah.
how it inspires them when they're trusted, how it brings out the best in them, how they want to live up to that trust being given and rise to the occasion, how they perform better when they're trusted. To be trusted is the
Yeah.
most inspiring form of human motivation. It brings out the very best in all of us.
Yeah.
We need more understanding around that, around the why of not only being trustworthy. I think we're getting a lot on that, but the why of trusting and going
Stephen,
deeper
that
on being
is
trusting. That's what I think.
so good. Yeah, that is so good. And in fact, on our next conversation, and we could do this again, is I would love to dig into that because our whole focus has been on those drivers, those components, those levers that you talk about. And it would be an amazing in another conversation to dig deep into that. I am so grateful that you did this, that to have this conversation, to know you, to call you friend. And Sab, bring us home.
Such a
Thank you, Rob.
rich conversation. Thank you so much. Stephen, we want our listeners and those that are watching to know how they can connect with the work that you're doing, your impact globally. What is the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, well, thank you, Sabbath. And thank you, Rob, for your kind words. And again, we're back to where we started, Rob. I feel like I'm with a kindred spirit
Yes, for
that
sure.
is part of my purpose and mission that is aligned with yours. And I'm expressing it around to increase trust in the world. And you're expressing it around developing, leaders that are whole and integrated leaders with trust
Mhm.
as a vital, as the foundation of doing precisely that.
Yeah.
So we're doing a very similar work, and that's inspiring to me.
Yeah.
And so thank you.
Mhm.
To learn more about me, maybe you could go to my website, Speed of Trust, and there's a variety of tools and some videos and some information to go deeper on this. And you could follow me on social media. At Stephen M. R. Covey on Instagram and on X, and then on LinkedIn is the platforms I tend to use the most. Stephen M. R. Covey, you could follow me there, but I would say just the website would be the best place to learn more and to go deeper and to also be able to connect with me or in these or via social media and to go deeper. My main works are the Speed of Trust and Trust and Inspire. I also wrote a book on smart trust,
Yeah.
which is about really, not just indiscriminately trusting, but being smart about it. But I really believe that our biggest opportunity is not that we're not trusting enough. It's not that we're trusting too much, although maybe in a few cases, I think the bigger opportunity is that we're not trusting enough. We
Mm.
need more of that. And so,
Mm.
that 13th behavior, extend trust, being trusting to go along with being trustworthy to create that trust. So, but
So good.
speedoftrust.com is probably the best
Okay.
place to learn more, to go deeper. And then you can follow me on the social media platforms. Love to have it.
Perfect. And Stephen, we have one last wild question.
Let's
Are
do
you
it.
in a season of accepting yourself or changing yourself?
Both. I'm always changing myself. I view myself. I'm a work in progress, even on trust.
Yeah.
You know, I've not arrived at. I love the metaphor my father used to use all the time. That a plane that leaves L.A. and arrives in New York is off track 90% of the time, just slightly, and just course corrects along the way, and you just always course correction. But they arrive at the destination. And so I feel like I'm slightly off track most of the time, but my direction is good and
Yeah.
I'm going the right direction and I'm going to get there, but I just will always want to get better. But I'm viewing myself as a work in progress, trying to improve, trying to get better, trying to live these principles of trust that I teach. Falling short, but then when I fall short, I try to right the wrong. One of my behaviors to build trust
Mm.
and make it right. And so, I'm on the journey. And yet I do believe that there's something to accepting. I don't want to be complacent. And if I was only accepting, this is back to the paradox, Rob.
Hmm.
If I were only accepting without progressing and improving myself, then I wouldn't have enough I would be not humble enough to recognize that I've got a long ways to go. I have not arrived. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I do. I like who I am. And I feel like I'm on the right path. And that gives me a sense of security, of clarity, and hopefully of some power of who I am, in that I have principles that I try to live by.
Mm.
And that sense of changelessness in a changing world gives me roots.
Mm.
But I need the wings too, and I need to course correct and to change and to improve. And so I think I'm both. And I like who I am, and I want to become the best version of myself. And I'm on a journey to do that.
Well said.
So good.
Thank you, Stephen.
Stephen, what a gift. Thank you so much.
Well, what a gift to be with the two of you. And Rob, really love the work that you're doing and the research you're conducting as
Yeah.
well. We need it on trust. We're, again, co-catalysts in helping to bring about a renaissance of trust in our world today.
Grateful to be on the journey with you. Yeah.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.